of attorney is one way to do that, to register the power of attorney with the GP, but we're a long way from having that in place. I do believe, noble lords, it is incumbent on GP practices to get up to speed, that when they have patients on their records, there should be a clear segment in the computer system that clearly shows, if they turn up with a patient, that they know who the carer is and make the carer welcome.
There are some deep concerns, and I've seen a number of things on television recently where actual children are acting as carers for their parents. Whilst I think the normal assumption is that carers are looking after elderly people or those who are particularly disabled, would my noble friend not agree that we need to be particularly careful to identify situations where children are actually carrying out those functions and assist them as much as possible?
Well, my noble friend is absolutely right and raises an important part. The Department of Education's new data on young carers collected through the school census published last year is an important step to improve their visibility in the school system, allowing schools to better identify and support their young carers. This will also provide an annual data collection to establish long-term trends. We will be considering the findings from the census to inform the next steps.
My Lords, on older unpaid carers, Carers UK on International Women's Day last week stressed that older women aged 75 to 79 are providing the highest number of hours of unpaid care, 50 hours a week, and that there's been an alarming increase since 2011 in women over aged 85 providing unpaid care. These are not the women who come under the government's award of 1 week's unpaid carers leave from work. Neither will they be first in line for the small amounts of respite care funding GPs have been allocated. So how is the government addressing this situation, and what specific actions will be taken to alleviate this terrible burden of care these women face?
Well, the noble lady raises a very important point, and as I've already mentioned, the government has conducted a census and looking at the data to identify those carers that the noble lady has recognised. We have various groups of carers that all have different needs. My noble friend has just mentioned child carers, and the noble lady has just mentioned those carers of working age. Employers have to be sympathetic and understand, but also those at age 85. That's very, very challenging. And those individuals who are of that age scale, as I alluded in the previous answer, the GP practices has to be able to identify those people so they can work with social services and the local authority to make sure they are supported.
My Lords. The Archbishop's Commission on Reimagining Care, based on conversations with many unpaid carers, recommended there should be a new deal for carers, including restorative breaks, financial supports and support from employers, including paid leave and the right to request flexibility. Does the Minister agree that any future national care strategy should consider the need for unpaid carers to have flexibility in their paid work?
Well, the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Leicester, raises a very important point, and we welcomed his report that he referred to. The Department of Business and Trade is bringing a new leave entitlement of 1 week available to all employees, including those working in adult social care, providing care for a dependent. This is on top of existing statutory holidays. The Carers Leave Act 2023 and flexible working regulations will come into force on the 6th of April. Under the Carers Leave Act, eligible employees will be entitled to 1 week of unpaid leave per year. This is just the start, my lords. The Right Reverend Prelate's absolutely right. Good employers should be able to recognise when employees need time off, because it will happen to the employers at some stage in their lives.
My Lords, my Lords.
My Lords, pursuing the point on the healthcare needs of unpaid carers and how the NHS treats them, the government's white paper on adult social care reform included a range of measures, including some markers, voluntarily used markers, to identify unpaid carers in NHS health records. And that was about their own health needs, not about supporting the health needs of those they were caring for. Could the Minister say what progress has been made in this vitally important area?
Well, in the People at the Heart of Care, published in 2021, we set out a strategic approach to empowering unpaid carers. And in October 2023, the Department of Social Care launched an Accelerating Reform Fund. It provides almost £43 million over 2023-2024 to support innovation in adult social care and services for unpaid carers. This takes forward our commitment to invest £25 million to bolster the care services that support unpaid carers.
Second oral question, Baroness Hayman of Ullo.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, secondary legislation will be laid in the near future, which will make it illegal for larger organisations and their subsidiaries to use regulated commodities and their derivatives in the UK if produced on illegally occupied or used land. Around 70% of tropical deforestation for agriculture is illegal. Therefore, the government believes that that is the most effective approach to halt and reverse deforestation. It's the most important way of supporting producer governments to strengthen their forest governance and domestic laws.
My Lords, we understand the importance of getting these measures right and of working with partners to ensure that they have the greatest possible impact. However, waiting more than 2 years after the passage of the Environment Act is a choice. The Minister knows there is appetite for regulation, including in the financial services industry, where separate commitments have been made. What does near future mean? Can he guarantee today that these important provisions will be enforced by 2025? If not, other than grabbing some headlines during COP26, what is the government actually doing to prevent deforestation?
The government is doing a lot to prevent deforestation in addition to this measure, which, as you know, came from the Glasgow Leaders Declaration that we led at the COP26 to put an end to deforestation and land degradation by 2030. And we are putting this in place. She will ask the date that it will be laid. We have a few tweaks to make because we are in negotiation with the EU to make sure that we are getting this right for Northern Ireland and that we are working with them to make sure that products that come from these countries that are then processed and exported to the EU will be working under two systems. We want to make sure that we're getting that right. But in addition to this, we are doing a range of different activities, including our investments in forests and sustainable land use, our Partnership for Forests, which has mobilised £1 billion in private investment and has brought 4.1 million hectares of land under sustainable management and benefited over 250,000 people. I could go on, but we are doing a lot in addition to this measure.
My Lords.
We welcome these measures. We note that DEFRA consulted on them in December 2021, and they only cover illegal goods and apply to businesses that have global turnover of over 50 million per year and use over 500 tonnes of beef, leather, cocoa, palm or soil per year. Can I ask the Minister if the Government will commit to the full alignment with the EU's deforestation regulations, which cover all forest commodities sourced from both illegal and legal deforestation?
Well, the EU's deforestation regulation is far from settled and is causing great concern. I've had meetings with representatives from a number of producer countries, and on trips to countries like Costa Rica, I met with many others. And so it is not right to say that the EU system is done and dusted, and there are very great concerns amongst producer countries that it can mitigate against precisely the people who are living sustainably close to or in forest environments. But we have started with these four, and we have a very fast, for these sort of measures, review in 2 years' time, which will see possible additions which may comply with what the EU is doing, but we have no idea if they are going ahead with all 6 or whether they're going to go ahead with the same 4 that we are.
My Lords. My Lords.
By Global Witness, it's found that both HSBC and Barclays are financing companies who are purchasing product illegally on illegally deforested land, particularly in the Cerrado, which is a complex ecosystem that is not covered as tropical rainforest, and it's fallen between 2 stools, but in fact it is producing an enormous amount of meat. Schedule 17 is meant to cover it, just has weak definitions. So the beef that's produced as a result of this deforestation doesn't necessarily end up here in the UK. So we can't just focus on the trade alone to stop it. We have to look at the money and where the money is flowing. So my question to the government is, do you remain committed to developing, quote, clear due diligence standards for the financial sector through the Treasury's review of deforestation finance, which was commissioned in the Financial Services and Market Act and committed to in the other place by the then Economic Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Griffiths?
Yes, we do. The Treasury are proceeding with their review, but of course alongside that we have the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is not just for financial institutions in this country, but has become the international byword on making sure that financial institutions are themselves regulating and making it clear to other investors and shareholders that their supply chains that they're investing in are in accordance with the Glasgow Leaders' Declaration.
My Lord,
I'd like to congratulate my noble friend, because I know he shares a great, deep concern on this issue, and he's probably as impatient as many of us in order to get this, but we know it's not always that easy. Perhaps my noble friend can answer whether the government will require commodities and products that are in scope to be traced back to farm level.
I thank my noble friend. We are indeed working as quickly as we can to get this on the statute book, and we want to make sure that we are absolutely clear for those companies that are in scope, as the noble lord on the Liberal Democrat bench has described, are able to say from their supply chains right back to where the project came from in the first place, that they are in accordance with these regulations. If not, we have a very clear sanctions programme that we've been bringing forward in the statutory instrument, which will hold them to account.
My Lords, we know that we have fewer trees in this country than most countries in Europe. Yet we equally know that trees capture CO2 and other noxious gases. And if we're going to meet our national obligations to try and reduce global warming, we're really going to have to step up of planting of trees. There's no other way we're going to be able to do it.
The noble lord's absolutely right. We have to practice what we preach domestically, and that's why we have put an enormous amount of money through the Climate for Nature Fund to exactly promote that, and through other schemes that we are encouraging land managers to look at tree planting, and we are seeing an increased numbers of trees being planted, and the supply chain to support that is so important. I've just come back from Costa Rica, who have doubled their tree cover in recent years, and we want to significantly increase ours in the UK.
My Lords, we have continue with biomass subsidies after 2027. I would like some confirmation on that. And secondly, ancient forests in Canada are still being cut down to make wood pellets to supply companies like Drax, who has had billions in subsidies. It isn't clean energy, it is highly polluting, and also it's not economical. So why is the government still doing that?
I will write to the noble lady about Drax, because it is a very complicated issue, and it sits into the UK's net zero balance sheet by balancing it in terms of what Canada is doing, where the wood chip comes from. And I want to be absolutely right in my answer to her, so I will write to her.
My Lords, further to that question, and I entirely agree with the noble Baroness. What is the government doing spending hundreds of millions of pounds in subsidies to Drax in order to have trees cut down in America and then brought across the Atlantic? And all of this is because somebody has designated burning wood as ticking the box for saving the planet, which it clearly is not.
Biomass is a perfectly legitimate renewable energy source if the wood that is being used is a renewable and sustainable harvest. Where the noble lord and the noble baroness are absolutely right is that if they are using the wrong sort of timber and shipping it to this country at huge carbon cost, then I think that the taxpayer, shareholders and investors need to know the precise and genuine cost to our net zero commitments that is placing.
Lords, the noble Lord the Minister referred to earlier comments about Northern Ireland.
Order. 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 It's the turn of the Liberal Democrat benches.
My Lords, as in my capacity as Chair of the Environment and Climate Change Committee, I wrote to the Secretary of State for DEFRA, Steve Barclay, on this issue on the 14th of February. As yet, I haven't had a reply, nor has the Chair of the Environment Audit Committee in the other place, who actually wrote to him earlier than I did. So I wonder if the Minister would use his good offices to ask when a reply might be forthcoming.
I wasn't actually clear what the letter was about, if it was about Drax or whether it was about the forest risk commodities, but whatever it is, I will chase it and make sure the noble Baroness gets it.
Third oral question, Baroness Young of Old Scone.
I beg leave to ask a question standing in my name in the order paper and draw attention to my interests as set out in the register.
My Lords, I declare my land management interests as set out in the register. I appreciate that it has been a long wait, and I'm happy to confirm that the land use framework will be published before the summer recess this year. The Government has made significant progress in the areas that your Lordship's Land Use in England Committee identified as policy priorities. The Government intends to engage widely on the framework, both pre- and post-publication, but is not planning to consult formally on the framework.
Can I thank the Minister for his response? He said it had been a long time waiting, and indeed I have 40 successive Hansard assurances over the last 2 years that the land use framework would be finished and published by December 2023, the last one dated from November 2023. So that didn't happen. So I welcome the Minister's assurance that it will be published before the summer recess, but I don't think I'm holding my breath. So can I just ask the Minister to assure the House on a number of issues to do with the framework? Will it integrate all of the key land uses, including infrastructure and housing and transport, and not just those for which DEFRA has a responsibility of agriculture, carbon and biodiversity? And will the Government, in its engagement before and after the publication of the framework, as the Minister outlined, engage widely with the 140,000 landowners who ultimately own the land and will decide on how their land will be used? Because I think he needs to reassure them that such a framework is not a top-down diktat, and assure them that landowners will be still able to make decisions about their own land and will be incentivised for adopting options which are broadly in line with national policies and targets.
Well, I thank the noble Baroness for her questions, and she raises some really important points. I think the noble Lord, who's been the recipient of the previous 40 questions on the land use framework, might be sitting quite close to me at the moment, but as the 41st recipient to respond to this query, I am incentivised to come up with the answer, as I said, before the summer recess. The future, and naturally there are several government departments with interests. We're working closely with these departments to understand their land use expectations and feed this into the framework. The government supports the principle of multifunctional land use, in essence land sharing rather than land sparing, and the framework will provide land managers and farmers and other interested parties with guidance so that they can make effective decisions based on local knowledge and local strategies, as well as understanding national requirements. And the framework is not intended to be prescriptive and force people into certain categories. It's essentially guidance.
Will my noble friend confirm that this will not just cover DEFRA's subjects, but the wider range of things which the noble lady pointed to? Because a land use strategy that doesn't cover the whole range of areas, including infrastructure, is not going to be one which is very acceptable. And how are we going to consult if there's to be no consultation?
Well, I thank the noble lord for his question. Several government departments have targets with land use implications, and we're working with them to understand and take account of their land use expectations, as well as those within DEFRA. This includes the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, the Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, the Department for Transport, and the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And we are in consultation with all these departments at the moment.
I attended a soil health conference this morning, which was excellently chaired by Baronesses Heyman and Baroness Bennett. Soil health is synonymous with appropriate land use. My lords, the repeated refrain from the experts was the importance of localised knowledge to manage our essential soils, including at individual field levels. In developing this land use strategy, what steps will the government take to ensure that local land managers who know their land best are properly and actively consulted?
I thank the noble lord for his question. The government are not currently planning to consult formally on the framework. We're not convinced that the benefits of formally consulting outweigh the burdens it could place on the many sectors involved in land management. We have engaged with relevant groups during the development of the land use framework, including other government departments, as I said, devolved administrations and academics, including the Royal Society. We intend to engage more widely ahead of the framework's publication. Most importantly, the development of the framework has also been informed by those managing land and farming. This has included working with farmer groups and investigating the decision-making processes of those farming in different landscapes across England.
My Lords, I think the noble Lord the Minister has answered the question about the involvement of other departments and getting expertise in from the outside. The House of Lords report was quite adamant that this should be an ongoing process. And I was wondering whether the noble Lord the Minister could tell me how often the DEFRA and the government would envisage this strategy being renewed. I mean, would it, for instance, be coincidental to the statutory obligation of DEFRA to report on the self-sufficiency of our food supplies from the UK, which is a 3-yearly obligation? And I was just hoping that maybe we could combine the two, because what you're describing in all this consultation is quite a big exercise, and one will hope that one will have a consistent body in order to further this process.
Well, I'd like to start just by paying tribute to the noble lord and the other members of his committee for the excellent report that they produced. And as he rightly points out, this is an iterative process. We're not going to do it just once, put it in a file, and that's where it's going to sit forever and be a sort of rigid structure. I don't have the details of exactly how that process is going to be updated yet. I'm hoping very much that will form part of the final report when it comes out from the Secretary of State shortly.
My Lords, it's disappointing that there's been a delay in the publication of the strategy. Previously, the noble Lord has given us assurances that we will be seeing it shortly. So it's interesting that shortly has now become before the summer recess. I thought I'd look up what shortly was, the definition in the Cambridge Dictionary, and it is soon. With the example given, we will shortly be arriving into King's Cross Station. So does the noble Lord the Minister agree with me that it's a jolly good job he's not in charge of our railway services? We will see that before the summer recess, or will we be seeing the use of shortly?
Well, as a frequent user of the train service between here and Edinburgh, shortly I do appreciate can mean lots of different things. I think when the Secretary of State, when he took up his position at the very beginning of December, he wrote to Lord Cameron of Dillington saying, listen, this is a really important subject, and it's absolutely crucial that the Secretary of State is completely happy with the report that is going to go out in his name. And I think it is entirely right that he takes the time to reflect on the report that was being formulated at the time, put his own stamp on it, and make sure he's entirely comfortable with it when it comes out before the summer recess.
How is the government approaching the design of financial and policy levers to encourage decision makers at all spatial scales to reach decisions which are broadly in line with delivering national targets and policies?
Sorry, I didn't actually hear the question.
Do it again. How is the government approaching the design of financial and policy levers to encourage decision makers at all spatial scales to reach decisions which are broadly in line with delivering national targets and policies?
Thank the noble Baroness for her question. I did catch most of that. Perhaps I might write to her in due course with the answer once I've actually caught the whole thing. That would be very kind. Thank you.
My Lords. My Lords.
The primary concern in any such framework needs to be its flexibility to react to circumstances, which means that it can only at best be guidance which you have affirmed. More specifically, please could the Noble Lord the Minister confirm that valuation issues will be carefully studied, as confiscation of value due to arbitrary designation will be a major concern for those who work the land.
Well, the Noble Lord is absolutely correct that this is not a framework that is designed to be prescriptive in any way, and it will take into consideration all aspects of land ownership, land management and land use. And I can assure him that it'll be top of my radar to make sure that there is no value destruction for those at the recipient end.
Fourth oral question, Lord Clement Jones.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
My Lords, in line with the established practice under multiple administrations of all political colours, ministers are provided with legal support and representation where matters relate to their conduct and responsibilities as a minister. As set out in Chapter 6 of the Cabinet Manual, ministers are indemnified by the Crown for any actions taken against them, for things done or decisions made in the course of their ministerial duties. The indemnity covers the cost of defending any proceedings, as well as costs or damages awarded against the minister.
My Lords, can I thank the Minister for that reply? The Prime Minister put it in a rather different way. He said there's a long-standing convention stretching back many years that the government will fund those legal disputes when it relates to government ministers doing their work. Doing their work, my Lords? How can making party political libel posts on X on a Friday midnight constitute ministers doing their work, my Lords? And why should this settlement come out of the public purse? Isn't this a breach of the Ministerial Code, after all?
Yes. As I said, it's long-standing practice, and indeed the Secretary of State concerned made a statement this morning at the Lord's Science and Technology Committee and explained the circumstances in full, including how she was engaged in official work and got support from officials in the disputed letter.
Could the Noble Lord the Minister just explain how all of that works if this was a post on X at midnight?
I think the Secretary of State explained very fully, but there was a letter, and that took over the course of 2 days to draft, clear and send this letter to UKRI's CEO to ask for an investigation, and she highlighted it on X using the same medium as the original issue.
May I ask the Minister about the civil service dimension of this? It's reported that a number of senior civil servants were working until midnight on a Friday evening for a non-emergency text message that the Minister wished to send. This does seem to be an entirely unreasonable use of civil servants' time. Civil servants do work out of hours, but only for emergencies. And if they're asked to work late into the night and over the weekend, that's something which is an abuse by ministers of civil servants.
The Secretary of State has explained her actions fully. I refer you to her statement. Legal advice was taken, and the important thing is that that was taken, and subsequently there was a full and final settlement of the dispute, and the Secretary of State made clear that she should have sent the letter in confidence to UKRI and apologised for that. But the basic principle is that it's very important that ministers are able to seek advice on work that they carry out as part of their official duties. Otherwise, there would be a chilling effect on public life. And this has been important through all administrations.
Chilling effect were to extend to stopping ministers posting things on social media at midnight, we might all be able to live with that. The Minister said that the indemnity covers the activities of her fellow minister in her activities while fulfilling her duties. So can the Minister advise the House which of her ministerial responsibilities the Secretary of State's comments attacking two academics were fulfilling? And will she also explain why the taxpayer should foot the bill for a blatant abuse of position and power by the Secretary of State that further undermines the standing of the very UK research institution that her department is actually supposed to be promoting?
The Minister is responsible for non-departmental public body UK Research and Innovation, and she was operating in that context, and her intentions were always to do the right thing. And it's very important that ministers can do this. And of course, there's insurance of fees, which is provided by the House at taxpayers' expense, in the case of where professional indemnity insurance cover defamation. The House of Lords Commission, I think, is due this week to discuss the provision of professional indemnity insurance to peers. And of course, in the private sector, there is indemnity insurance, because as a director, you have got to act in good faith and in the public interest.
That the protection should only last while pub hours are in place, because it's quite clear what happened on this case.
The truth is, as I know well, as a government minister, you do work late, and as government officials often work late as well. And I think this is a serious point about how you make sure that ministers are properly advised on issues, and that is what was happening on this occasion.
Government seems very keen to be lecturing everybody else about extremism these days. Would they like to take a look closer to home at the extremism in their own ranks, in particular very major donors?
Well, I think I'd say on extremism that, as the Prime Minister said in his very important speech 2 weeks ago, we've seen an unacceptable rise in extremist activity seeking to divide our society and hijack our democratic institutions. And it's our duty to ensure that the government has all the tools that it needs to tackle this ever-evolving threat.
Part of the role of Science Minister is to champion the scientific community within government and to protect it from political interference. What action is the government taking to repair the damage caused by the Secretary of State's highly regrettable actions and the libel case that followed?
I don't see it that way. The Minister gave evidence this morning at the Lord Science and Technology Committee. There was a brief discussion of this matter. They then moved on to discuss important points about science, which she and this government are extremely supportive of and have done so much to make sure that the UK leads the world in science and technology, is one of the leaders in the world in science and technology matters.
It's another case of the government marking its own homework. What is the ethics advisor, the government's own ethics advisor, saying about this? Has the government taken a proper view from the ethics advisor?
I think advice to the Prime Minister, including from the ethics advisor, is not something that we would comment on.
Sympathetic with the Minister who is prone to having hospital passes from her colleagues, which don't help her at all. Does she really think that her explanation at the dispatch box will convince the British public, let alone the Daily Mail?
I think the statement that the Secretary of State made this morning was full and clear, and I have a great deal of respect for the Secretary of State, and the action she took in the aftermath of the 7th of October was very understandable, and we have now moved forward, we've resolved this thing, and we should be caring about how we improve science and technology in this country.
Secretary of State told the committee that she is now clear that she should have sent the letter privately. Was she advised by her officials working at that time of night that it would be appropriate to send part of it on X? If she wasn't, then she was acting with her own personal judgment on the issue. So why is the taxpayer having to pay for that error?
Yeah. I've explained the circumstances about why the taxpayer gets involved in legal expenses, and I note the Noble Lord's point.
When the Secretary of State gave a statement at the Science and Technology Committee this morning and was remarkably unconvinced, particularly by the assertion that by the Permanent Secretary that all of the aspects of this case had been discussed with legal and technical advisers before the relevant Twitter was made. I would simply like to ask the Minister whether she thinks that was valid advice. Is this the way the government thinks that a senior cabinet minister should communicate with a body for which she has responsibility?
My understanding is that the legal expenditure was approved by the department's accounting officer. That was made clear. The permanent secretary was there, I believe, with the minister, and I would refer, Noble Lords, to her statement and to all that she's done, and the fact that she apologised to move this matter on.
That concludes oral questions for today. We now come to questions to the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs. First question, Lord Young of Cookham.
I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
I have no immediate plans to meet with the Commission President, but I do meet regularly with Joseph Borrell, the High Representative, and with Maros Sefcovic, who's the Commissioner responsible for the UK-EU relationship. The Prime Minister meets regularly with the Commission President, and they have a very strong relationship.
Reply. My Lords, in last week's debate on financial affairs, a number of Noble Lords proposed that Russia's frozen assets should be used to send armaments to Ukraine and repair its damaged infrastructure. And my noble friend replied sympathetically, saying we are aiming for the maximum amount of G7 and EU unity on this. My Lords, 6 months ago, at the end of an EU summit, where there was broad support for that proposition, the President of the Commission said the next step would be an actual proposal. So when my noble friend next meets the President, will he urge her to make progress with the next proposal, because Ukraine needs every help it can get?
The Noble Lord is completely right that Ukraine needs our help and needs our help urgently. What we're continuing to do is discuss with allies the best legal basis for making progress. We believe there are a number of options. There are these collective countermeasures you can take, saying that all countries have been affected by Russia's illegal invasion, so there's that legal basis. The Americans believe there's a case for using individual countermeasures, arguing that their individual country has been affected. Nonetheless, what we need to do in the G7 is get the maximum degree of unity. It may not be possible to get everyone to agree to the same process or the same amount, but we're hoping to make good progress.
My Lords, whenever the Noble Lord, the Foreign Secretary, next meets the EU Commissioner, will he take on board the need to resolve the supply of veterinary medicines under the Windsor framework to Northern Ireland? Because the recent command paper said that technical solutions would be pursued with the EU Commission. Could the Noble Lord, the Minister and the Foreign Secretary indicate what discussions have taken place or will take place, and will he give assurances to your Lordship's House that these issues will be resolved in order to ensure the expeditious supply of veterinary medicines and vaccines to farmers in Northern Ireland?
Closely at the particular case that the Noble Baroness raises. What I would say is that the Windsor framework I think was a very good piece of negotiation that has helped to get the institutions back up and running in Northern Ireland, and that's wholly welcome. Of course, there are still issues that we need to resolve, and I'll look carefully at the one she raises.
My Lord, it's a good place, of course, to have a meeting. Would be at the European Political Community. Now, originally, the meeting was going to take place in the spring of this year. In January, the meeting was suddenly going to be in the first half of this year, and no date has been yet set. I wonder if the Noble Lord the Minister could tell us why there's been a delay in setting the date and when the date is likely to be set.
What I can say to the Noble Lord is I'm confident a date will be set and an excellent venue will be provided and the meeting will be a great success. What we found in this early part of the year, there's a bit of a traffic jam of summitry because there are so many different summits and things coming at the same time that finding the right time where the leading people that need to be there can be there has been a challenge. But I think we're very close to meeting that challenge, and I'll update the House as soon as I can.
On the question of the manufacture of weapons and munitions for Ukraine, is the Foreign Secretary aware there is very great concern that there is a depletion of these weapons in this country? And can he give us an assurance that manufacturing in this country of weapons and munitions for Ukraine will be stepped up very considerably over the next few weeks and months?
I think I can give that undertaking. The Prime Minister announced the package of support for Ukraine at over £2.7 billion, and that will ensure that Ukraine has the support they deserve from the United Kingdom. I'm fully aware, the government's fully aware, that we need to make sure that we step up production, not just for Ukraine, but also to make sure we deal with our depleted stocks. But I would also say that at the same time there's a real task to be done all across those countries that support Ukraine to look at any weapon systems that are close to their expiration date, because those are weapon systems that we won't be able to use and that they could use now.
Lords, during the current Foreign Secretary's sabbatical from politics, his immediate successor as Prime Minister, Mrs May, was negotiating an EU-UK security treaty. Does the Foreign Secretary think that now is a good time to reopen such discussions, precisely in light of the situation in Ukraine? Because it's one area where potentially we could have common cause.
Well, what I would say to the Noble Baroness is I don't think we should rule out different ways of working with the EU, but I would actually say that the Ukraine situation, I think, shows how the current arrangements can be made to work and made to work well. I've always said that after Brexit, Britain should aim to be the best friend, neighbour and partner of the EU, and I think Ukraine shows that's exactly what we are doing. We've found ways of working together through these various formats, including the Wiesbaden formats and others, and I'm not sure that it's necessary to form some sort of structured way of working when we've managed to do it on an ad hoc and rapid and effective basis.
Last, can I come back to the question raised by my Lords? Can I come back to the question raised by the Noble Lord Young about repurposing seized Russian assets for use in Ukraine? He'll be aware that the recent G20 meeting of finance ministers, there were different views expressed at that meeting. I'd be grateful if he could say something more about the positions taken by the UK representative at that meeting. And following on from his comments last time we had questions on this issue, could he say something about the discussions he's had with other nations who have adopted a more cautious approach, and has he been able to find a way forward or more agreement?
What I can say to the Noble Baroness is that we have taken quite a forward view. We think there is a moral and political case for doing this, and we think that the supposed economic damage that would be done we don't really see that as being a strong argument. It's certainly true that some other countries are more cautious. Some of the European countries, EU countries, are looking at perhaps potentially spending the interest on the capital sum rather than the capital sum itself, but we are still making the argument for the maximum amount that can be done, because our view is simple, that one day Russia will have to pay reparations, and it doesn't make sense to wait for those reparations. It makes better sense to use the frozen assets and to make that money available now.
My Lords, one of the weapon systems that Ukraine could certainly deal with is the Taurus missile from Germany. The German Parliament has passed this for being sent to Ukraine, but for some reason the Chancellor Scholz is holding it up. Is there anything we can do to encourage the Germans to send the Taurus missile to Ukraine?
I am very grateful for the noble Lord's question. I spent some time in Germany last week making exactly this argument. It's obviously a sovereign decision for Germany, and just as we don't like being told to make sovereign decisions by other people, we should couch our arguments carefully. But the argument I made is that there's no doubt Storm Shadow has been incredibly effective, and there's no doubt that it hasn't been escalatory because it's been used in a responsible and correct way. And the other point I think that is worthwhile making is that if we want peace, we're more likely to get a just peace through strength and through backing our words with actions. And so we make these points to our German allies, but ultimately it will be for them to decide.
When the Warren Secretary wound up the debate a short while ago in this House, he said that he thought that ad hocery was often quite a good approach in negotiations with European counterparts. And I can understand that in terms of taking advantage of opportunities when they arise. However, given the huge range of difficulties that businesses, particularly small businesses, are having at the moment in trying to surmount the various non-tariff barriers to trade between us and the EU, don't we need also a very focused and a very comprehensive approach to the forthcoming negotiations with the EU?
I think the noble Baroness is right to put it like that, but that's what the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is about. We do have a sort of structured cooperation when it comes to that part of our relations, and obviously it's up to us in the time before it's re-examined to make the most of it, and also to look at, well, what other things could we do to help small businesses. And so things like VAT thresholds, also the issue which I've raised before about electricity trading, these are some of the things, some of the ideas that we're putting forward and we think could make a difference.
My Lords, can we look forward to an agreement to regard to Gibraltar, and if so, by when and with what conclusions? The trilateral, I'm referring to the trilateral negotiations.
Well, generally speaking, in negotiations, it's not a good idea to have too many artificial deadlines. Obviously, there is something of a deadline coming up, which is that we're heading for a new set of EU elections, and so a new set of Spitzenkandidat, which I remember from before my brief, how did you put it, holiday, sabbatical. So I think there is a deadline in that. I'm confident we can reach a good agreement. My honourable friend, the Europe Minister, was in Gibraltar yesterday having talks with the Chief Minister. So I think there's a good basis for an agreement, and we're working very hard to try and bring that about.
Second question, Lord Oates.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name in the order paper, and in doing so I declare my interests as set out in the register.
My Lords, I've raised this issue directly with the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I completely understand the concern to ensure that private sector debt is fully part of debt restructuring for low and middle income countries. There are a range of arguments we should consider on this issue, and we need to be mindful of the impact that legislation could have, including on the cost of and access to finance for partner countries.
And my Lords, I thank the Foreign Secretary for that answer. He will be aware that lobbyists for private creditors made the same arguments ahead of the Debt Relief Developing Countries Act 2010, but when the Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition reviewed the working of the Act in 2011, it found that it was a successful measure with no evidence found of unintended or adverse effects. So, given that the majority of relevant bonds are governed by English law, will the UK take a lead to ensure that private creditors take part in sovereign debt restructuring on the same terms? And will he work with the New York state authorities who are also considering this issue?
Well, obviously I remember fondly when we were working together and passing the act to which he refers. I think when that act was passed, there was a real problem with vulture funds acting as sort of holdouts in debt reconstructions. And while there are still arguments for the approach he's taking, we do have to think, first of all, will it affect the cost of capital for poorer countries to borrow? Will it affect the availability of capital? And crucially, now that we have the collective action clauses and the majority voting provisions, is it still necessary to have this sort of legislation? The IMF reviewed this in 2020 and came to the conclusion that things were working well. So there is a concern in my mind that the approach he's talking about is perhaps relevant for what was happening in the past rather than what's relevant for what's happening now. But I think we should keep our mind open on it.
Is there not a current example with more than $1 trillion owed in debt by 150 countries in the world to China through Belt and Road, making it the biggest debt collector in the world? What assessment has the Noble Lord, the Foreign Secretary, made of the implications on dependency, including the extension of China's military presence in the world? And in this 75th anniversary year of the Commonwealth, is he not particularly concerned about the way in which the CCP has been marching into that void, not least as a result of the cuts we have made to our overseas aid and development programme?
Well, what I'd say to the Noble Lord is it's very important is that we provide alternatives to finance so that Commonwealth and other countries have a choice. I'm very proud of the work I did to set up the Caribbean Infrastructure Fund, for instance, and we're looking again at whether we can refresh and renew that. And if you look at the multilateral development banks and the fact that we're trying to expand their balance sheets and get them to lend more to poorer countries, all of these are ways in which we can offer countries alternatives to Chinese finance in the way that he suggests.
My Lord, should we not look at the recent example of Sri Lanka, where that country decided that it had to seek the help of the IMF. The IMF themselves responded speedily, but the problem was the private creditors and the time that took. So does it not a case for perhaps the IMF to produce some dimension whereby there is a structure that all private creditors can use or be advised to use, so that a speedy decision is made to the benefit of the poor people who are suffering?
What I'd say to the Noble Lord is, of course, when it comes to bonds, if that's the form of lending, there are these collective action clauses, so that can prevent private sector holdouts. And when it comes to loans, you've got these majority voting provisions, so a group of private investors can't hold up the resolution of those debts. And I think that is the right way forward. In terms of Sri Lanka, we welcome the official creditor group deal for Sri Lanka that was reached on the 29th of November 2023, and the bondholder committee is currently in negotiations with the government of Sri Lanka. We don't comment on ongoing restructuring programmes, but we hope a deal will be arranged soon.
The Act was an excellent example of cross-party cooperation, because it actually was passed by the Labour government and implemented by the coalition. But today, the United Kingdom and New York have a unique power to do something in leadership in terms of this important issue to a substantial part of the world, because 90% of the private lender contracts that are causing the problem are written under either English or New York law. Does the Foreign Secretary acknowledge and approve the efforts of New York to bring in legislation to make sure that private creditor terms are equivalent to those of other creditors, which they are not? And if so, what steps are we taking, if any, to coordinate with New York to ensure that similar legislation can be enacted here?
Thank the Noble Lord for his question, and it's true that what was teed up by Gordon Brown was nodded into the net by the coalition government, and rightly so. But looking at the law he mentions in New York State, in Albany, that they're looking at, we don't think that is actually likely to get through. It's been sitting around for a long time. It's good in its intentions because it's trying to sort this issue out. But as I say, the IMF advice and the Treasury advice is that if we legislate in this way, particularly if we do it unilaterally, that will affect the cost of finance to other countries, it will affect the availability of finance to other countries, and it may mean that more of these financial deals are written elsewhere in a less advantageous way than is currently the case.
My noble friend, the Minister,
in the last few years has led...
Bishop.
Sure.
My Lords, we as a country carry a weighty moral debt to many low and middle income countries given our history. This moral debt is borne by business as well as government, and indeed by charities and faith institutions. Will the government revisit the International Development Committee's report on debt relief and the evidence supplied by the Jubilee Debt Campaign and Make Poverty History to consider again how all sectors may work together to ensure a joined-up approach to supporting these countries?
The Right Reverend Prelate is absolutely right that we need to have good arrangements for this, and that's why the common framework was put in place, because of course the old arrangements under the Paris Club were fine when most of the debt was being written by France and Germany and Britain and America. The common framework tries to reflect the fact that a lot of the money is now coming from Middle Eastern countries and indeed from China, and to make sure that all these countries can be involved in the resolution of these situations. It has been moving too slowly, but I still think it is the right approach to try and include this wider group of lenders in these resolutions.
The Noble Lord is saying in terms of legislative routes to bring private creditors into debt negotiations, it is extremely complex, but does he accept that what was included in the International Development White Paper is insufficient to deal with the problem of debt? And will he commit to look at what further measures we can undertake to find a solution to this, including a new definition of debt sustainability, so that we could better understand what could be achieved?
I absolutely agree with the Noble Lord that first of all we must keep this under review and keep looking at it and ask ourselves what more we can do. But I think as we do so, we should be guided in part by the IMF, who have a definition of debt sustainability. I mean, even on their definition, things look very bleak when you look at the number of countries either in debt distress or at risk of going into debt distress. But I think what's more necessary than a new definition is making the arrangements, like, as I've said, the collective action clauses, the majority voting provisions, making those things work.
My noble friend the Minister mentioned the Commonwealth earlier on, and he will be aware of the Public Debt Management Programme of the Commonwealth, which supports member countries to effectively manage their debt portfolios. What conversations has my noble friend or colleagues in government had with Commonwealth colleagues about public management of debt of many of these countries who are Commonwealth members and non-Commonwealth members?
Thank the Noble Lord for his question. It's an ongoing conversation with the Commonwealth about, this is one of the many good advice services that they give. So it's an ongoing conversation we have. This year, in the year of Chogham, we're also spending a particular amount of time talking with Commonwealth countries about how they can access finance, not loans in this case, but actually green finance. A lot of finance has been made available, but many of the smaller countries find it hard to access that finance, and it's something we should help with.
Poorer countries have increasingly become dependent on a growing amount of private finance, and for some of them time is getting critical. So we need to address the issue, announce reform, but have emergency considerations for those companies who cannot wait until we resolve it. Does the Secretary agree that that needs to be done, and we cannot afford to let these countries default or allow the private sector to get away when the taxpayer is taking the risk?
Where I really do agree with the Noble Lord is that what we don't want is what we had in the past, which was vulture funds holding out for a better resolution than other holders of debt were getting. As I say, if we have new bonds with collective action clauses and new loans with majority voting provisions, then that is much less likely to happen. Plus the other innovations that Britain has brought, such as the climate resilient debt clauses. So if there is a sudden problem caused by climate change or indeed other shocks, then you stop the repayment. So I would argue that Britain has a long tradition, on a cross-party basis, of helping with debt sustainability, with helping with debt resolution, and we need to keep that record up.
Question, Viscount Stanfield.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper, because humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza and the release of the hostages are both top priorities.
My Lords, we are doing all we can to increase aid into Gaza. We've been collaborating with Jordan on humanitarian airdrops and are now working with partners to operationalise a maritime aid corridor from Cyprus. However, this cannot substitute delivery by land, which remains the best way to get aid in at the scale that's needed. Israel must open more land routes, including in the north, for longer and with fewer screening requirements. I've been clear, we need an immediate humanitarian pause to increase aid into Gaza and get the hostages out. Israel must remove restrictions on aid and restore electricity, water and telecommunications.
My Lords, the House understands that aid from the air is problematic, that from the sea takes time, but can the Foreign Secretary explain to the House why he has been unable to persuade the Israeli government to allow the border crossings to be open to provide the access for the hundreds of trucks that are needed daily? And what is the government intending to do that when the aid reaches Gaza to the people who so desperately need it, that it's distributed to the people on the ground by local networks that are not controlled by Hamas?
What I say to the Noble Lord is, first of all, we have repeatedly made points about the need to open crossings and allow more aid in, and I can give the House the latest figures, which are slightly more encouraging, because the number of trucks per day on average in January getting through was 140. It fell to 97 in February, but so far in March it's actually gone up to 162. So I think we are making a difference. The opening of Kerem Shalom, that happened and did make a difference. But what I'd say, particularly with regard to what's happening on the maritime front, which is encouraging, but if Israel really wanted to help, they could open Ashdod port, which is in Israel, that is a fully functioning port that could really maximize the delivery of aid from Cyprus straight into Israel and therefore into Gaza. In terms of his question about how to make sure aid gets around Gaza, this is one of the trickiest pieces of the jigsaw. One of the things Israel needs to do is to give out more visas to UN workers who are capable of distributing the aid when it arrives into Gaza.
My Lords, I'm very pleased that today that Mark Bryce and Richardson met with Kogat. And I'd like the Foreign Secretary, Noble Lord Foreign Secretary, to confirm the following. Firstly, there is no backlog at all at Kerem Shalom, crossing from Israel. There is a backlog at Rafah. There are columns of trucks there in sovereign Egypt after they've been inspected and cleared by the Israeli authorities. And thirdly, as was just said, sadly, there is also a backlog on the Gazan side where the UN agencies are struggling to distribute the aid at the pace that Israel is facilitating it through.
Well, I'm delighted that Mark Bryson Richardson, who I appointed as my aid coordinator, has met with Kogat. I think that's very useful. What I'd say to my noble friend, the Noble Lord, is yes, of course, that getting more aid into Gaza requires the work of more than just Israel taking the relevant steps. But Israel is the country that could, I think, make the greatest difference because, of course, some of the blockages and the screening problems and all the rest of it are their responsibility. And one proof point of that is there were 18 trucks dispatched from Jordan, and they were held for 18 days at the Allenbury Bridge King Hussein crossing. Now that does seem to me the sort of thing that we need to act on faster to get that aid into Israel. And as I said to the previous question, once it's in Gaza, it does need people to distribute it, and that is about visas and capabilities and deconfliction.
Situation in Gaza. The situation in Gaza, my lords.
That have been put in place are unnecessary blockages. He was very eloquent in that description. He will also agree with me that Article 50 of the Geneva Convention, when it comes to the requirement of occupying powers for children, is that they will not, quote, hinder the application of food, medical care and protection for children under 15 years, expectant mothers and mothers of children under 7 years. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that these hindrances and these blockages are potentially a war crime under the Geneva Convention? And for any of those ministers in the Israeli government who are actively blocking the inward supply of aid, then we should be considering sanctioning those.
What I'd say to the Noble Lord is it is our legal position, and has been for some time, that Israel is the occupying power in Gaza, and that was the case actually before October the 7th, because after the evacuation of Gaza in 2005, it wasn't truly freed up as a sort of independent functioning territory. And so it's true that how Israel behaves as the occupying power in terms of allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza, that is a material consideration when it comes to looking at how they are complying with international humanitarian law. And I've said at this dispatch box already many times, what matters there is, do they have the commitment, do they have the capability, and are they complying? And that's what we keep under review.
Well, my lords, actually the words that the Noble Lord has just used are the words he used last Tuesday. But today in the Commons, Andrew Mitchell was asked a question by Lisa Nandy precisely on this point, particularly in relation to the BBC's investigation into the treatment of medics at the hospital in Gaza. Now, what I really want to know, she said to Andrew Mitchell, why we are not ensuring that the Israelis comply with the provisional measures of the ICJ. Andrew Mitchell was unable to support Lisa Nandy's call. Why?
Well, I think what I would say, and it's what Minister Mitchell said, I think, in the House of Commons, is these are very disturbing pictures and reports that have come out from this hospital, and we need to get to the bottom of what exactly happened, and we need answers from the Israelis about that. And when we have those, then it'll be easier to comment.
So, my lords, has been caused by Hamas, who hide terrorists and weapons in densely packed civilian areas and steal food and fuel meant for humanitarian relief. And it is absolutely clear that there is no prospect of peace, let alone the two-state solution the government wants to see, until Hamas are completely removed from power in Gaza. And this is why the government should be doing all it possibly can to ensure Israel has all the support it needs to win this war.
What I would say to the Noble Lord, and I thank him for his question, is we completely agree that you're not going to have a two-state solution if the people responsible for October the 7th are still running any part of Gaza. Now, obviously, what we would like to see is this immediate pause, the hostages released, and then a series of conditions put into place to make sure that pause turns into a permanent ceasefire without a return to fighting. And one of those conditions would be the people responsible for the 7th of October, the leadership of Hamas, would have to leave Gaza, and the terrorist infrastructure would have to be dismantled. And if that won't happen through a process of negotiation, then he's no doubt right that there would be a return to fighting, and that needs to be understood by people.
My lords, this side, this order. My lords, can we hear from the cross benches and then the Conservative benches?
No.
My lords, can we hear from the cross benches and then the Conservative benches?
I thank the Noble Foreign Secretary for his first response, which set out very clearly and very practically what the government is trying to achieve in the Middle East. The problem, though, is pretty clear. The problem is the Israeli government, who are not prepared, it seems, to accept the suggestions by yourselves and the United States. So will you now make it clear to the Israeli government that their continuing pressure on Palestinians, especially on their women and children, is absolutely unacceptable? And furthermore, that it risks antagonizing millions of Arabs and Muslims for years and years to come. And I say that having served for many years myself in the Middle East.
Well, I'm very familiar with the Noble Lord's service in a number of our embassies in the Middle East and his long experience in that part of the world. What I'd say to him is that we have said repeatedly that Israel must abide by international humanitarian law, as was said by the Noble Lord Austin. Israel does have a right to self-defense. You know, Hamas started this conflict by their appalling invasion and terrorist pogrom in Israel that led to the murder of over 1,400 people. And it is worth remembering that they still hold these hostages. We're more than 150 days in. If Hamas wanted to end this conflict, they could do so tomorrow. They could do so today by releasing those hostages and getting their leaders out of Gaza and laying down their weapons. They don't do that. But he's absolutely right to make the point that we had this experience fighting terrorist insurgencies in our own country, in our own history. You have to obey the rules and obey the law. And if you don't, and you lower yourself to the standards of the people you're fighting against, that does not end well.
Baroness Smith of Basildon.
My Lords, I beg leave to answer the question standing in my name on the order paper.
The BBC World Service provides high-quality news to global audiences, especially where free speech is limited. Its emergency services, including a pop-up service in Gaza and before that in Sudan and Ukraine, provide critical updates to people affected by conflict. Meanwhile, BBC Ukrainian continues to be vital in countering Russia's narrative around the invasion. The funding from the FCDO, over $100 million a year, helps sustain high-quality broadcasting in 42 languages and the BBC's vital work to counter harmful disinformation.
My Lord, it's good to be able to agree with, I think, every word that the Foreign Secretary said. And he's right. The BBC World Service is trusted as an independent voice without state interference. And its integrity and its honesty is a lifeline for so many. He mentioned Ukraine. At that point, they went to extraordinary efforts to ensure that people in Ukraine could get accurate information despite the efforts from Russia to block the information. Now, he will know that reporting, particularly in emergencies and from areas of conflict, brings huge risks to those journalists. In 2019, the then Foreign Secretary, now the Chancellor, committed £3 million from the UK to the Global Conference for Media Freedom. And the purpose of that was to encourage a free press everywhere, but also to protect journalists who are trying to deliver that. And I just wonder, given that's now a few years since that money was committed, and the aim was to bring other countries together, is he able to give a progress on work so far, on what we've been able to achieve?
I thank the Noble Baroness for her question. I don't have the information on how many other countries are involved, but I do know that the Coalition for Media Freedom is something that we continue to support. And let me say how much I back up what she said. It's essential that we have journalists reporting from these areas. And while I don't want to go into any specifics, we've also helped a number of different news organisations with COGAT and others when they've needed to leave, and I think it's very important we help make sure they're supported in this way.
Russian disinformation is rife in the Western Balkans, and it's having a malevolent influence there. The Noble Lord, the Foreign Secretary, will recall that the chair of your Lordship's International Relations and Defence Committee wrote to him, suggesting, amongst other things, the restoration of the BBC Albanian service, which was scrapped in 2011. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that it would be foolishly short-sighted not to use one of the most powerful soft power tools this country possesses, and not to target it against the greatest immediate threat to the peace and security of Europe?
Yeah. Noble Lord is absolutely right that the BBC is an incredibly strong voice in terms of media freedom and in terms of our values and the things that we stand for. What has been happening over recent years is a transformation into a more digital service, because more and more people now listen to radio services on their mobile phone or through other internet devices. So that's what's been happening. So the 42 language services are still going. They haven't been closed. A number of them have been switched to digital. I completely agree with him, though, about the need to combat fake narratives in the Western Balkans. I would argue it's not just the BBC, good though it is, it's also making sure that we help countries like Kosovo, like Bosnia and others in terms of their rebuttal of the false Russian narrative, and that is about training and expertise and funding, as well as about the BBC.
The Noble and Gallant Lord Stirrup just mentioned, one of the most wonderful things the BBC World Service has provided is DARS, aimed at Afghan children aged between 11 and 14 and hosted by female journalists from the BBC evacuated from Afghanistan. And it uses BBC Bite-Size to supply lessons for those whose education was stopped. The UN calls DARS a learning lifeline. Does the Noble Lord, the Foreign Secretary, and I'm going to avoid saying what my friend said, the Prime Minister, not agree that this is reason enough for the FCDO to commit to maintain the funding of the World Service at an appropriate level so that such life-changing contributions can continue? And he can he commit to this? As he knows, the present agreement ends in March next year.
Thank the noble lady for her question. What I'd say is obviously the BBC World Service is now funded in two ways. There's the money direct from the Foreign Office and there's the money through the licence fee. That is settled and fixed out till the end of this coming financial year. It's basically a third from the Foreign Office and two-thirds from the licence fee, which I would argue is a pretty fair way of doing things. Obviously, we've got the funding review of the BBC underway. We've got the charter review of the BBC coming up. This is a very good time to have that conversation. The government, to be fair, has put its money where its mouth is, because in the integrated review refresh, we gave an extra 20 million to the World Service.
My Lord, can the noble Lord update the House on what further representations HMG has made to the Iranian authorities about the harassment, prosecutions and convictions being meted out to journalists working for the BBC Persian service, including the harassment of London-based staff and their families back in Iran?
I'm very grateful for that question. Documents published online suggest that 10 BBC Persian staff have been tried and convicted in Iran in absentia of propaganda against the Islamic Republic. I think this is completely unacceptable behaviour. We do raise these issues with our Iranian counterparts, and also when I last met the Iranian Foreign Minister, I raised the case of the fact that Iran was paying thugs to try and murder Iranian journalists, providing free and independent information for Iran TV in Britain. So on both counts, in my view, they are guilty.
My Lords, I draw attention to my entry in the register. I was very heartened by what my noble friend has said in support of the BBC. But what happens when the disinformation is coming from the BBC itself? Was he as disappointed as I was with the reports of World Service, particularly the Arabic Service, which sought to justify the murder of civilians on the 7th of October and downplayed sexual violence? And doesn't it undermine the BBC unless we adhere to those very high standards that we display in other parts of the world?
No, I thank my noble friend for his question. I mean, obviously, it's right that the BBC World Service is operationally and editorially independent. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have views on what they do and what they say. And for instance, on whether the question of whether Hamas is a terrorist group, I couldn't be more clear. They are a terrorist group, and I believe the BBC should say so. So editorial independence doesn't mean that politicians or anyone else isn't allowed to view. We are, and those views should be taken into account.
My Lord. The Foreign Secretary said a few moments ago, in response to the question for the Noble Baroness Bonham Carter, he mentioned the BBC review, government review into BBC future funding. So can I ask the Foreign Secretary what input he intends for his department to have into the review, given that its scope includes the World Service, which of course gets around a quarter of its funding in granted aid from the FCDO?
Well, obviously, it would be a bit unfair on my government colleagues to announce at the dispatch box exactly what view I will take in these internal discussions, but I think what I can say is I strongly support the World Service in a world in which we have so much dispute and so much misinformation and poisonous channels like Russia Today and China's a channel sponsored by China and all the rest of it. You know, the BBC, we should be proud of the fact that it is the most respected news source, and also if you add in BBC television and BBC.com, it doesn't reach 318 million people, it reaches 411 million people, which makes it the most watched service as well, so we should be proud of that. I think we do have something of a jewel in our crown, and we should support and promote it. That said, I'm also proud of the fact that I was the Prime Minister that put in place a quite tough settlement for the BBC, but it was a 6-year settlement. And I think that proved that if you give people a consistent horizon of how much money they're going to get, but ask them to make some savings, they can improve the service.
My Lords, can I echo the Foreign Secretary's comments about the BBC and declare my interest as a trustee of Tate and a radio broadcaster? One of the things that interests me is that our museums and indeed our orchestras and theatres tour the globe, having to raise money from philanthropists and foundations. Isn't it time that my noble friend, the Foreign Secretary, brought his considerable experience and expertise to the Foreign Office in developing a cultural policy for the Foreign Office that builds on the amazing work of the BBC World Service, as well as these incredible institutions in the UK that tour the globe?
Well, I'm grateful to the noble Lord, my noble friend, for his question. I think we do have a policy of using culture as a diplomatic weapon. It's something the Foreign Office is very comfortable with, and I think that we should do that, and the suggestions he makes are excellent ones.
Noble Lord, the Minister say what consideration is being given in his department to the possibility of the funding of the World Service being taken back onto the FCDO budget in entirety? And does he not agree that that is a more effective but also a more equitable way to deal with a matter which is an essential part of our soft power and not to pile it all on to the licence payer?
Well, I always listen very carefully to the noble Lord because he has great experience of this. I think that actually the fact that some of the money comes from the licence fee is not such a bad thing. It's about 7% of the total. And as someone who's a licence fee payer but also spends a lot of time listening to the World Service, I think it's fair that that contribution is there. I also think the link between the World Service and the rest of the BBC in terms of the website, which is very important in terms of the news channel and all the rest of it, I think having that link up is not such a bad thing. The important question is the BBC World Service funded appropriately for our ambitions to counter false narratives around the world and to spread democratic values? That's the key question.
Lords, that concludes Secretary of State's questions for today. Private notice question on support to Haiti and CARICOM. Lord Griffiths of Buryport.
My Lords, I beg leave to ask a question of which I've given private notice, and the question is as follows. To ask His Majesty's Government what support they're providing to CARICOM and the people of Haiti following the resignation of Prime Minister Ariel Henry and the reported collapse in law and order in that country.
The UK is concerned about the worsening violence in Haiti and the impact on the neighbouring Turks and Caicos Islands. We remain committed to supporting a Haitian-led political solution. We commend efforts of partners across the Caribbean and beyond to support orderly political transition in Haiti. We urge all parties to move swiftly to bring much-needed security and stability for the people of Haiti and the region. We continue to support Haiti through our contributions to the United Nations agencies and the World Bank, and are committed to help secure the Turks and Caicos Islands, and particularly their borders.
I'm most grateful for that reply, and particularly the words Haitian-led solution, which has not been the case in just about every other initiative that has been attempted. Just how low Haiti has sunk can be illustrated by the report I just heard of the putrefying body of a patient in a hospital on a bed alongside another bed where a patient very much alive was awaiting treatment. In just such a hospital, my two boys were born, and I can't bear to think of the kind of suffering that the people of Haiti are undergoing at this time. I'm very glad that there's a regional initiative coming from CARICOM, and I do hope His Majesty's Government will feel able to contribute in a significant way to the discussions that are going on. The diplomatic skills necessary for a good outcome will be considerable, and I believe that we have those skills in this country, and I believe that the United Kingdom, if it chooses to be involved, will find a great welcome from the Haitian leaders and people. However, there are lessons to be learned, and perhaps my question comes from those. I have in my hand a document, an internal document from the United Nations, a cry session after 15 years of failure where 2,500 troops were deployed in Haiti to stabilize the country from 2004 to 2019. And I'm not going to do much more than read just two sentences if the House will oblige. And it is, I can see I'm being asked to wind up. It's the first time I've done this, and you'll just have to be patient. Exactly. Yeah. The last 20 years of the international community's presence in Haiti has amounted to one of the worst and clearest failures implemented and executed within the framework of any international cooperation. Instead, this failure has to do with 20 years of erratic political strategy by an international community that was not capable of facilitating the construction of a single institution with the capacity to address the problems facing Haitians. After 20 years, not a single institution is stronger than it was before. It was under this umbrella, provided by the international community, that the criminal gangs that today lay siege to the country fermented and germinated, even as the process of deinstitutionalization and political crisis that we see today grew and took shape. So would His Majesty, would the Noble Lord give me an assurance that His Majesty's government will learn from mistakes that have been made badly? We are a country that provide money to the United Nations to do this work. Can you give me that assurance?
I can certainly give the Noble Lord the assurance that we should always try and learn from the lessons of history, particularly when we're trying to help with fragile states, something that I've spent some time trying to think about. What I can tell him is we will be making a contribution to the multilateral, the multinational security mission to Haiti. It is principally been established by the United States, who will be providing $300 million. There should be over 1,000 troops, including from Kenya, to try and bring much needed security, because I think one of the lessons, although it's not the final answer, but to try and provide basic security is going to be fundamental. But I would be frank with him and with the House that Haiti is not where Britain has tried to lead. We have many countries and places where we feel we have either special knowledge or a special relationship or existing partnerships. This has always been somewhere where we contribute. I think our contribution is £30 million a year through the international bodies, but it's not one where we've chosen to lead. We've left that to the Canadians and the Americans and others who have more expertise. But I think the points he makes are very good ones.
The problem is, my lords, that every time something awful happens in Haiti, we put a sticking plaster over it, and the situation deteriorates now to the point where it's completely lawless. There's been a complete breakdown in law and order. My right honourable friend, the Noble Lord, the Foreign Secretary, is absolutely right in saying this isn't within the sphere, as it were, of British interests, but he should not underestimate, and I'm sure he doesn't, the influence we have and the goodwill we have in the wider Caribbean. So can he commit that rather than just provide finance through organisations such as the UN, that the United Kingdom would be prepared to play a role in a long-term solution for that benighted country?
I know that my noble friend has considerable experience, having done this job in the Foreign Office for many years. What I would say to him is we certainly will talk with colleagues and friends in CARICOM about what they intend to do. I think our priority should be to focus on the Turks and Caicos. They are our responsibility as an overseas territory. We are looking to deploy a reconnaissance team there because there's concerns about their borders and their security, and I think that should be our focus immediately, but while offering help, assistance and advice, as he suggests, to the people of Haiti and to the CARICOM nations that are coming together to try and help.
Inmates have been freed from the prisons in Haiti by the gangs there, with police stations being burnt to the ground and generally complete anarchy now applying. In welcoming what the Foreign Secretary has said about Secretary of State Blinken's announcement of the $300 million program to send a security mission, can he tell us when that mission is likely to be sent? And in welcoming what he said about the United Nations agreement with Kenya to send 1,000 police officers, when are they likely to be able to be sent to actually restore order in this very urgent situation?
I'm afraid I can't give an update on exact timings. I mean, what has happened, as he knows, is that the UN have given backing through a Security Council resolution to the existence of this force. So it's not a UN force, but it's UN-backed, which I think is important. But I'd agree with him about the general point, which is it's so important it's able to do its work. People who follow these things make the rather, I was thinking it's a rather odd-sounding phrase, that the state has to have a monopoly of violence, but it is true. You cannot possibly have development and progress and success when you've got quite so many different armed groups in charge of different parts of this country.
Indicated that the deployment of the Kenyan police forces would be illegal under Kenyan law unless there was a reciprocal agreement with the Haitian authorities. That's why the former Prime Minister of Haiti was in Nairobi. Now there is no vehicle by which to have this authorised from the Kenyan government. So what is the Foreign Secretary's assessment about the capability of actually having a deployment of those forces, since there will be now no functioning government of Haiti to have a reciprocal agreement? And given the fact that there'd be no elections for 8 years, no functioning parliament, no functioning judiciary, and the warning signs last years of the violent gang, the warning signs last week of the violent gangs, Haiti is slipping in potentially into a failed state. So what technical support are we providing those that may provide security assistance?
The Noble Lord is certainly right that the failure to hold elections is one of the contributing factors to the chaos that we now see, because after the assassination of the former president, the fact that elections weren't held is clearly one of the aggravating factors that there have been. In terms of the role of the Kenyan forces, that is a matter for Kenya to decide. I would think that with the United States providing $300 million, with the backing of the UN Security Council, that it will be possible to put together a mission in this way. As I said, it's just not something that Britain will contribute with in terms of personnel, but we're happy to make a small contribution in terms of finance.
The dramatic escalation of violence has severe impacts on humanitarian situation, and particularly the food security of millions of Haitians. And last year I discussed the dire situation then because of the violence with the WFP's country director for Haiti, Jean-Martin Bauer. So can I ask the Noble Lord, the World Food Programme's warning of a potential hunger catastrophe in Haiti, what steps are we going to take to respond to that warning? And are we supporting assistance to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access and the free flow of food commodities into Haiti?
Well, I think the reassurance I can give to the Noble Lord is that whenever the World Food Programme or any of the other operations of the United Nations come forward with a sort of call for support, the United Kingdom always steps up, and we're a funder of their programs. As I said, while we don't have a bilateral aid program with Haiti, our annual contribution is something like 30 million when you add up what we do through the various UN bodies. I think it sounds to me as if the problem is going to be not so much the availability of food, but the situation in terms of lawlessness and lack of safety. And so I do think the security aspect is the thing that has to come first.
My Lords, obviously this is a horrendous humanitarian crisis, and I agree with the Shadow Minister in his assessment of it and the need for the UK to do what we can to help abate it. But as the Foreign Secretary said, our principal responsibility does lie with the TCI. And will he look back at the lessons to be learnt from the 2010 earthquake that did trigger at least 2,500 refugees coming from Haiti to the Turks and Caicos Islands? And many of them were indeed refugees who arrived illegally. And whilst the Foreign Secretary obviously is going to put emphasis on trying to help the TCI with security and their borders, some refugees will need help on the ground. And so can he tell the House exactly what he's going to be doing, working with the government of the TCI to help with that particular problem?
Well, what I can promise the Noble Lord, my noble friend, is that we will work very closely with the Turks and Caicos Islands government. As he knows, we're currently funding police officers there. We're currently helping with border security. And as I said, we're going to be sending this reconnaissance mission to help them in terms of the border security. But if there are additional burdens and additional needs, I'm sure that we will entertain those. And I know that my colleague, Minister Rutley, who's worked very hard at all the CARICOM relations, will be leading on this.
My Lords, does the
register of interest, my Lords, we've had not many questions. The Labour Party, if I may say so, had 2 questions, one of them one of the longest I've heard in this House, and I think we should hear from the Noble Baroness.
Thank you. My Lords, does the Foreign Secretary agree that there is a limit sometimes to what His Majesty's government can actually do in different countries in turmoil, many countries all around the world, and that actually we do have to have priorities, and that there are other countries that should be doing more, like France, for example? Does he agree with me that while we give diplomatic support, that we should be very careful about tying ourselves up with putting lots and lots of extra money into a country that is like Haiti?
I think the Noble Lady makes a very good point. I mean, as they say, if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And we should be frank about our, as I was in my answer to the Noble Lord who asked the question, but also about our capabilities here. We do have a mission, but it's based inside the Canadian mission, and Canada's taken one of the leading roles in helping Haiti over the years. We have, I think, 2 country-based staff who are currently working from home rather than in that mission because of the dangers in Haiti. The other staff we have work out of the Dominican Republic. So we should be clear that, you know, we don't, in some countries, we have a scale where we're able to act and scale up quite rapidly. That's not the case in Haiti.
It was a pleasure to give way to the Noble Lady. I refer to my register of interest, in particular as a member of the Haiti APPG. My Lords, the problems in Haiti have been going on for a number of years. Since 2021, the UN estimates that nearly 400,000 people have been displaced internally, half of them children. Therefore, my Lords, does the Noble Lord, the Minister, the Foreign Secretary, agree with me that the external imposition has failed when it comes to solutions, and that we must use our influence within the region to ensure that the solutions to these problems come from within Haiti and from within the Caribbean?
Well, the Noble Lord speaks with considerable expertise as he sits on the APPG. All I would say is, if you look at any of the situations where we have tried to help stabilize a country after the first requirement of security, which is clearly the priority now, all the evidence shows that unless you can build a government that has the support of all the different parts of that country, and it may well be a provisional government to start with, unless you can do that, then very often you're sunk right from the start. And we can look at examples from Afghanistan to Yemen, to Libya, to elsewhere, where the need for an inclusive political settlement that's designed in that country by the people of that country is absolutely crucial.
The country with shared border with Haiti is the Dominican Republic, that has a record of receiving or sending back into Haiti the refugees that came from Haiti. Is the Secretary of State minded just to not forget the Dominican Republic, because they're very much in play and not often remembered in this place?
I'm sure they will have a important role in terms of advising CARICOM countries, advising the Canadians and the Americans who are taking the lead in this operation about what needs to be done to try and bring some stability and some security to this very bad situation.
My Lords, it may be for the convenience of the House if I allow a very short pause before I call the next business.